Welcome back. This is week 5, lecture 1, the week of the rise of towns. And this lecture begins a new section of the course. And if you're listening to this lecture, that means you most likely have already submitted your first midterm, and maybe even have received the feedback on that. I tried to get to the grading of the midterms as quickly as I possibly can, so we'll see. Anyway, the point being is the first part of the course was setting the foundations of Christendom and what's going on. And now we're really getting into the period that the course covers by the title in terms of Europe in the High and Later Middle Ages. Because as we move into the 11th, 12th centuries, that begins the High Middle Ages, what historians have traditionally referred to as the High Middle Ages. And then the Late Middle Ages begin in the 14th century or so. Now, the title of this part of the course is the Medieval Renaissance, as you should see on the syllabus. And I just want to say something about that because it is an historiographical concept. As you may know, the Renaissance, the Italian Renaissance, has been around for quite a while, but so in some ways has the medieval Renaissance. The Italian Renaissance, and I'll be saying something about that more in the third part of the course, was really the creation of the Swiss historian Jakob Burckhardt. Burckhardt in the 19th century, 18, I forget exactly when it was published 2 volumes of Civilization of the Renaissance in Italy. And it's one of those classic works. It really is. He saw this period in the 14th century, 15th century in Italy among scholars as being a time of rebirth, renewal of classical civilization. Now, there's some evidence that scholars themselves in the later 14th, early 15th century, Italian scholars themselves, also viewed themselves as bringing about a rebirth of classical culture. I'll be saying more about that later. Again, when we get to the periods dealing with the Renaissance. But what had come before this Renaissance had been seen, or was seen then, as one long dark age, a middle age, the middle age between antiquity and Renaissance, the rebirth of antiquity. That was the concept. And Burckhardt has this wonderful phrase, something like, the veil hung over the eyes of Europe until it was lifted by the Renaissance and the sun that was finally able to shine through, and blah, 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 blah. And for Burckhardt, it all started with Petrarch as the first modern person. I'll be talking about that more later, too. But the point is, this set the field in some ways it still has. No one really follows Burckhardt anymore, even though he's a classic and is recognized as a classic. But yet, the fields of Renaissance still views themselves as the scholars within the field of Renaissance as doing something directly related to modernity, and what came before is old, is medieval. That's where the term medieval comes from. Medium aevum in Latin is the Middle Age. And it is set in our consciousness almost. We talk about the Renaissance man. We talk about all this stuff with the Renaissance, and it has these connotations of rebirth and wonderfulness. Now, that's all well, fine, and good, and we'll get there when we get there. But the point being, already in 1924, I think it was, though it might have been 26, but I think it was 24, the American medievalist Charles Homer Haskins published a very controversial book for the time. It was called The Renaissance of the 12th Century. And what Haskins argued is that a lot of the developments that Burckhardt had seen as being part of this Renaissance were actually already there in the Middle Ages, beginning in the 12th century. So we start talking about the 12th century Renaissance. And then that can be also then broadened out a bit to talk about the medieval Renaissance. And that's how I use the term, the medieval Renaissance, this period from actually the 11th century through the early 13th century or so. Now, this is the debate between the medievalists and the Renaissance people. And it is, as a medievalist, I'm squarely on the side of the medievalist side. But what is important here is regardless of how we label things, there were a series of developments beginning, as I've said, I think before the midterm, around the year 1000, so the beginning of the 11th century, that began to really demarcate this period of the High Middle Ages from the earlier Middle Ages. Before this lecture, for the first midterm, I already talked about feudalism. And yes, in the feudalism, as I said, the feudal system was codified legally in the 12th century as it was. So that's discrepancy between the ideal and actually what was going on. And that very well may have been, and here I'm speculating because we don't really know, because it was being challenged. The structures of society were being challenged. Now, again, this is maybe my big bugaboo, so to speak, or whatever the term is. But this concept that people in the Middle Ages simply believed what the Pope told them and didn't think on their own and blah, 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 is such hooey. It's not even funny. And we'll see that as we go through this. I think I may have already set this up. I don't remember, to be quite honest, what I've said earlier on. But rather than the age of faith being descriptive of the Middle Ages, we can see it as the age of reason. And the age of reason is usually a term that refers to the Enlightenment of the late 17th, 18th centuries. And with good reason, that's fine. Maybe even the scientific revolution going into that, that's fine too. But the person one of the people who actually argued this very clearly was Edward Grant, one of the leading scholars of medieval science of the 20th century, that if we look at the intellectual developments of this period from approximately 1000 to approximately 1300, we find reason coming to the fore. And we're talking about that during this whole period. Of course, this ties into your term paper in terms of the relationship between faith and reason. And that is one of the reasons the term paper is what it is. And, because it's like this historiographical debate between how do we characterize the Middle Ages as compared to the Renaissance, whereas the Renaissance is good, the Middle Ages is bad. The term medieval is often used as a pejorative. Oh, that is actually medieval. Oh my God, how horrible. For me, of course, medieval, that's great. Now, it's not like I want to go back and live in the Middle Ages. I don't. Okay? I don't. But the point is, our understanding of it has been so shaped by Burckhardt and this view that the Middle Ages were this dark period of intellectual stagnation, if any intellectual activity was going on at all, and people just believed and they followed the Pope, and everybody just bit down and said, yes, that's the way it is in this age of faith. That is so wrong historically when you look at the sources and what was going on. So that's kind of the general overview of what this part of the course is about, which will lead up to your second midterm, and then on into the later Middle Ages, looking to your final, and this whole question of how do we characterize and describe high and late medieval Europe is behind it all. And faith and reason is part of that. Because, as I would argue, there's no actual contradiction. But that's a long story in some ways. But the point is, how do we describe it? How do we describe what we see in the extant sources? So I'll be talking about some of those as we go through. You'll be reading some of those, also particularly focused on reason and faith, how they interact, because there are differences, etc. But we'll get there when we get there. And this first lecture, The Rise of the Cities, looks at a development within the economic, social, and political, in many ways, as we'll see, developments, and technological, as we'll see right away, um, developments that all occurred around the year 1000. Interesting changes. And one of those changes, which is where I'll begin this lecture with the first slide, is the increase in population. Now, if we look at this slide, the rebirth of population, the population rise, we notice that, first of all, I hope you know that graph there is just an image. It has nothing to do with how it really was. But what we do see is a continuous increasing rise of population from around the year 1000, which goes until 1348. And I'll talk about that when we get to the later Middle Ages in terms of what kind of kills that, the population growth, that is. But the point here is then, with the rise in population, the question is, where do the people go? All of a sudden, we have, birth rates are going up. People are having, more kids, and they don't need to have all their children work with them on the farm to produce livelihood and sustenance. And then we have, okay, what do we do? Let's say the extra kids that aren't going to, follow in their parents' footsteps. Where do they go? What do they do? And so we see increasingly a foundation of towns and cities. And we have these in charters. So we see a huge rise, or significant rise, in the foundation of towns and cities that, again, occurred around the year 1000. It just increases. Which is, we start thinking about that, okay, it's like, what do we do with this extra population? They go to the cities. And the impact of that is what this lecture is going to be about, because it is an important question. For example, if we have more population, we need more food. How do we get more food? The food supply has to increase. Now, this is a kind of the question of the chicken and the egg. Which came first? The increase of food supply that led to increased population, or the increase of population that led to the necessity of increasing the food supply? But all of these things go together. And we'll be talking next, in the next slide, about the technological developments that allowed for an increase in food supply. So these technological developments, the increased population and the increased foundation of cities and towns, all go together. And this is talking about the rise of towns. This is what we're talking about. It's not that there weren't towns before, but they were small and much fewer than beginning in around the year 1000. They start becoming more urban. Christendom begins to be more urban. Now, it's not urban like we think of the urban culture of today. And the number of populations of big cities is still rather small compared to us today. I mean, Indianapolis would have been the biggest city in the world at the time, or at least in medieval Christendom. I think London, I forget exactly the statistics in my head, but London, I think maybe, I don't remember. Jordan, in your text, may talk about the statistics in terms of population. But London eventually became a city of around 100,000. That's a big city, I believe it was. And some of these other cities we can chart as then needing support, food support, and it's also led to the rise of crafts, and we'll get into all those as we go through today, and also the developments. And all of these developments and changes put stress on what traditionally had been the structures of society under the general term, quote unquote, the feudal system, which I think I already mentioned, is not a very accurate term, but it gets at something, and that society is changing. And when you have an influx of population, that necessitates or almost forces change. And we'll see some of the forces as we go. So, if we now move from the rise of population to what made that possible, namely the increased food supply, And what made that possible were the technological developments. Now, here I have the slide, technological developments. I have 3 points here: the 3-field system, the heavy-wheeled plow, and the horse collar. You may say, compared to what we're used to in terms of technology, this is very elementary. But when you think about it, it's one thing when you look at it after the fact and think, of course, why didn't they come up with that earlier? Just as going way back when the whole development of writing was a technological development that we take for granted, except now with computers, maybe we don't take it for granted anymore. But that's when writing by hand, that is. But it was a huge transformation of society and learning. Now, so these technological developments were important. What were they? Well, first let's start with the 3-field system, because these all work together, but we're going to start with the 3-field system, because the manor, manorialism, as I talked about before the midterm, was based on traditionally what was called the 2-field system. So you have the manor or the plot of land, and again this is abstract, but it's important. It was known through experience that if you have a plot of land, let's say a big plot of land, I would have diagrammed this, but I didn't know how to put it all on the slide, and I couldn't find a picture already of it that I could get into a slide. So you're going to have to use your imagination and try to make a picture for yourself based on what I'm saying. But think of a big circle as the plot of land that was being farmed. Okay? If you farmed the whole thing every year, over time your yields would start going down because you'd be depleting the soil. And that was known. So what they did, they would farm half of it in year 1, let the other half lie fallow, as it's called, not farming it, using it for pasture land, grazing, and go back and forth that way. Now, all of a sudden, not all of a sudden, obviously, but this new development of the 3-field system was that, hey, what if we did it in thirds rather than halves? So we have 3 fields: field 1, field 2, field 3. Year 1, we farm fields 1 and 2 and let field 3 lie fallow. Year 2, we let field 1 lie fallow then, and we farm field 2 and 3. Year 3, we farm 3 and 1 and let lie 2 fallow, and then we're back to the cycle again, farming fields 1 and 2, letting field 3 lie fallow. And what they found was that did not deplete the soil, and it worked just as well as the 2-field system. And so all of a sudden, you're increasing your production. I don't have to work out the math, but you're farming 2/3 rather than 1/2. So 3/6, 4/6. You're increasing your production by a sixth. Because instead of just 50% of your land or half of your land, you're farming 2/3 of your land every year. So 2/3, 1/2. See, 1/3 is 2/6. 3/6 is a half. 4/6 is 2/3. So we're going from 3/6 to 4/6 of the land. But that's an increase in production just by that simple innovation of going from the 2-field system to the 3-field system. Now, that is, in essence, that. Now, we also find the development of what's called the heavy-wheeled plow. Why is that important? Well, not only was the technological developments going from the 2-field system to the 3-field system, but also was bringing more land under development, meaning making more land arable. Europe, what we call Europe today, was very wooded, and you can't really farm in the woods, and so like the amount of land available for farming was relatively limited, and the plow that they had was called the old scratch plow, a wooden scratch plow. which was simply kind of like a piece of wood. I can't get my hand. Stuck in the ground, boom, like that, and then pulled by oxen to make furrows in the land. Now, some of this makes a lot of sense to me because I grew up on a farm. And if any of you grew up on a farm, you know some of this is what I'm talking about, at least by analogy. We don't use, and I've never used the old wheel plow, but we did have plows that I understand. Now, and the oxen are big, strong animals, and they could pull this plow. But the old scratch plow, as it was called, could not cut through newly cleared land. Because what do you do if you want to bring land into production for farming? You have to cut down the trees, you have to clear it. And you just can't cut down trees, there's roots and everything else, and there's rocks. You have to clear, and a scratch plow can't plow through that. So what they developed was called the heavy wheeled plow. So you have wheels, and they used iron on to cut into it, the mold board, and a mold board to turn the soil over. So all of a sudden, instead of just making a scratch plow, you're actually digging in and turning over the soil. And you could use the heavy wheeled plow to clear more land and to help clear more land. Because without the heavy wheeled plow, it'd be very difficult to have brought more land into making more land arable, meaning making it farmable. So number one, we have then an increase in population, of course. We have an increase in production based on the three field system. And then we have more land being farmed, which also increases production. And also with the wheeled plow, yields increase because you can go deeper, you can aerate the soil better. And this is made up. I don't know what the yields ratio was, but let's say with the scratch plow, the yield was for every grain of sand you planted, you got grain of sand, grain of wheat you planted, whatever, every seed you got 4 pieces of grain from that. That's a yield of 1 to 4, let's say. Well, with the new wheeled plow, you could increase the yield from 1 to 4 to like 1 to 9. So the yield, the productivity of the land went up. More land is being farmed, more produce. And we go from the 2 field system to the 3 field system. All of this means significant, large increases in food supply because more land is being farmed, the yields are increasing, and the productivity is increasing. There's a catch though, because early on with the wheeled plow, it was found that the oxen could pull it, but it was difficult because an ox is big and it has to go by the neck, and an ox is slow. I said, what if we try horses? If we try horses to pull the heavy wheeled plow, maybe that would work. Well, so they were hitched up to horses. And if you know anything about horses, I know a little bit, not a lot, but a little bit. My great uncle on my father's side was a horse person, so I had some connection with horses. But if you've ever seen a horse, either in person or in movies, or whatever, their necks are not as thick as the ox. Now they can run faster than the ox. The ox is slow and plodding. But when you hitched the plow to a horse's neck, it couldn't pull it. Ox neck compared to a horse's neck. So what they did was they developed the horse collar. The horse collar could then harness the plow not to the horse's neck, but to the shoulders. And horses' shoulders are very strong. We don't talk about horsepower and engines for nothing. But if you've ever seen, this is probably showing my age, even though I think I've seen still some. It's not my favorite beer whatsoever. I think it's horrible. Budweiser. But they have the best commercials. and the Clydesdales. Those big horses are strong, and they have those big horse collars pulling the beer wagon. Those metal thing or wooden things sticking up, that's the horse collar. And if you can attach that, excuse me, to the horse's shoulders, they can pull it, and they can pull it a lot faster. So you have more land being brought into production. You having plowing more quickly than before, increased of yields, increase of productivity, all result in an increase in food supply. And throughout this course and on really until the late 18th century, when we get the Industrial Revolution, the wealth of Europe was based on agriculture, agricultural production. So wealth is increasing. When we talk about the technological innovations that were central for this economic takeoff, because that's what we're really talking about, and it's actually been referred to as that. I don't know if there are any economists in this course, but we still use the term economic takeoff when a country, often usually not an industrialized country, is going along and growing and growing, and all of a sudden it starts going, and then it really goes in terms of growth and productivity, economic takeoff point. That's what we're looking at in around the year 1000. There's a footnote on your exam. If you write around the year 1000, that's fine. Okay. If you write this was developed in the year 992, I'm going to say, where did you get that from? How do you know that? Because we don't know exactly when this took place, if that makes sense. Anyway, the point being, this was a major development that led to this economic takeoff, which led to the prosperity and led to all kinds of other implications and consequences of this economic takeoff. It wasn't just the technological innovations, it wasn't just the food supply, it also then led to the further increase of population, which led to the further establishment of towns. And when we get that kind of development together, what do we have? We have the rise of artisan and merchant classes. This is then the next slide. I have classes in parentheses on this slide because the term class, as it's used in this sense in terms of socioeconomic class, is a term that was only developed by Marx and Engels and then thereafter. So we talk about the different socioeconomic classes rather than the different orders of society. So if you realize we're talking about or using an anachronistic term, anachronism is using something later that comes from later to refer to something earlier. We're being anachronistic. If we think of it simply as separate groups or distinct groups of people, it's okay. It's all right. It's not technically correct, but it works because we're still working legally within the legal structure that was codified in the 12th century of those who fought, those who prayed, and those who worked, the three orders. And that structure remained until the French Revolution. That's a point, an issue. I think I may have also remembered that mentioned in a previous lecture that one of the great French medievalists, Jacques Le Goff, wrote an essay called The Long Middle Ages, when he said, the Middle Ages lasted until the late 18th century, because it was only with the French Revolution that legal definition of people into orders of those who fought, or the nobles, those who prayed, or the clergy, and those who worked, or the peasants, i.e. everybody who wasn't noble or part of the clergy, stayed in place until the French Revolution. And for most of society, for the majority of people, their lives in, let's say, 1700, even 1750, were not that much different from their lives in 1250 or 1150 or 1050. Now, there have been developments, yes. Now, and for some of the upper crust, so to speak, there have been a lot of changes, but for the majority of the population, less. But that gets into the French Revolution and how the oath of the tennis court, where we're not going to vote in the States General, the Parliament in Paris, based on the three orders, so that the nobles get one vote, the clergy get a vote, and everyone else gets one vote. We're going to vote based on population and representation. That was what was so revolutionary about the French Revolution. It overturned the legal feudal structure. So the point being, we still are working within this legal structure of the three orders, but there are tensions all over the place, and increasingly so. Not so much in terms of the nobility, those who fought, or the clergy, those who prayed, but those who worked, classified legally as peasants, referred to everybody else. And with this rise in wealth, with this economic takeoff, with the rise of towns, what do you need to support horses? What do you need to support increase in farming? You need blacksmiths. You need a whole increase of artisan work. That doesn't make much sense, but I hope you know what I mean. You need the crafts to support the agricultural production. So we have the rise of crafts and trade and commerce. And so we have this whole development not only of the technological creations that I talked about in terms of the three field system, the heavy wheeled plow and the horse collar, but we also have new developments in trade and commerce and in banking, because all of a sudden then the financing is important. And for trade, for long distance trade, which I'll come back to in a little bit in this lecture, you need financing. Yeah. So all these structures, and again, a lot of this, we don't think of the Middle Ages as being this period of economic growth and banking and finances, but it really was. Yes, the Italians in the later 13th century developed double entry bookkeeping, as it was called, and also other financial structures and institutions. But there's already, from the 11th century on, or the 11th, 12th century on, developments in trade, investment, the financing thereof. Because if you have this surplus, what do you do with it? Well, you can trade it. You can bring in new products, the things that you can't get here. So we can produce wool here, which is based on sheeping, which is based on feed, which is based on grain, and we can sell our wool to other countries that have other things that we want, including things like spices, salt, pepper, oregano. I don't know what kind of spices they had, but the whole point is that there was this long distance trade, which I'll be talking about later. And with trade comes commerce, and with commerce then comes these artisan groups and the formation of what's called guilds. And this is going to be very important. Because all of a sudden, if you are, let's say, in one of the new towns, if you are a baker or a blacksmith, you're not the only one in the town. And there are more towns around the area. You want to provide for the quality of your own product. So if I'm a blacksmith in a given city, right? I want to make sure that the city's blacksmiths as a whole are controlled somehow. Because if we have some bozo who doesn't know what they're doing, screwing everything up, we're going to get the reputation that, the blacksmiths of our town are no good, even if maybe it's only one or two that are no good. So they form trade organizations, they form guilds. Now, It works. It works. This is how it did work. All of the artisans. So if you're a baker, you have a baker's guild, blacksmith's guild, weaver's guild, etc. Okay, they establish standards for themselves, so not anyone could just come in and say, "I'm a blacksmith." You had to prove yourself, and if you were not accepted by the group of blacksmiths or bakers or whatever, you could not practice your craft. Now, if you were a young person and wanted to become a blacksmith, you could then become an apprentice. So you would work with the blacksmiths, and only when you had achieved a certain level of expertise and experience could you then present what was called your master work to show that you were a master blacksmith or a master baker or a master weaver, because those people were the ones who were running the guild. It was called a guild or Genossenschaft, but that's another whole another issue. Terminology. We call it guilds in English. So the structure was your apprentice, you go through a series of training, then you finally present your master work, and then are accepted into the guild of master bakers or master blacksmiths, whatever. This structure of guild structure was part of a new, or relatively new, way of thinking, of corporate thinking, because the guild functioned as a whole. What is a guild and what is a corporation? A corporation is a legal person, and we're going to see that shortly uh, too in this lecture in terms of talking about the communes and the incorporation of towns. But we really see the beginnings of corporate law in the guilds, in the trade guilds. What was allowed, what was not, so that the whole body would determine the policy for the group. In Latin, the word for that whole group was universitas, the whole. We still use that word in that sense. The universe. The universe is everything. Everything. It's the whole, the entirety of being. But we also use that word in terms of university. And we'll see when we get into the 13th century, the rise of the universities were originally guilds, trade guilds, and how that then developed. But that whole new thing, and then the students would go and study with a master and then present their master work to become part of the Guild of Masters or the University of Masters. And that's, going ahead. But it starts here with the guilds and the structures of the guilds in the context of the urban development and the economic takeoff within Christendom. Now, also we have guilds of bankers. But all of this is producing new wealth. There's still serfs, there's still people who are working the land without question. But all of a sudden, we have artisans, we have merchants, we have bankers who are accumulating significant wealth. And they are still legally categorized as peasants. These three orders, those who fought, those who prayed, and those who worked, were not all the same. The nobility, those who fought, includes everybody from the emperor to kings, princes, all the way down to local knights, the lower nobility, as it was called. The clergy included everybody from the Pope all the way down to your local parish priest. And the peasants included everything from extremely wealthy people to almost, well, they weren't slaves, but serfs, not fully free, tied to the land still. So there's this whole structure within these three orders. It's not just, oh, I'm a member of the clergy, we're all the same. Or I'm a member of the nobility, oh, isn't that wonderful? Or I'm a member of the peasant, isn't that horrible? It all kind of depends on where you are within this spectrum, within each of the different divisions. And when you have peasants who are far more wealthy than the lower nobility, there becomes tensions. Because at this time and throughout this course and on until the later 17th century, there are concepts of rights. There are no concepts of human rights, of inalienable human rights, as it says in the Declaration of Independence coming from John Locke. Like 17th century, the first person to talk about the inherent rights of life, liberty, and property. And that's, again, not for this course, but for subsequent courses. But there were rights according to your stations, your order. And there were responsibilities and there were privileges. And so all of a sudden, if you were a wealthy merchant, you might want to have some of the same rights that some of the nobles would have. But legally, you weren't supposed to have them. So there's all these tensions within society, within the structures of Christendom, that are causing shakeups and how do we handle things and what do we do, that only come out in the open much later with the overthrowing of Christendom, which we'll be talking about. I won't really be talking about that much here. Yeah, in the next course, 354, the Reformation. That's where I talk about kind of the crumbling of Christendom, as I call it. But for this part, there are increasing tensions. That's what I want you to see. And this all begins around the year 1000 with the economic takeoff that is based on the population increase and the rise of towns. That's why this rise of towns is not simply the number of towns and cities that received charters or that were established increasing. There's that too, but it's almost then refers to this whole development, technological, economic, social development. It's a major change in society. It really does. So banking, guilds, and trade, all part of it. And that then leads to the establishment of communes. Now, I have up here the origins of corporate law, challenges to the feudal system, free cities, and self-governance. I already said that the guilds, we find the origins of corporate law, but we really do with, and we do, because it's corporation, but with the communes. Now, the communes were not what we think of a commune, a commune from the 60s where you sit around and hold hands and, naked and smoke dope or whatever. That's not the idea of the medieval commune, which is the French term. The commune was the idea of an innovation of how do we handle ourselves now in the city. As a city, we're still responsible for our feudal dues to our immediate feudal overlord. Every one of us. How about we try to pay our feudal dues, not individually, but as a group, as a city, as a whole? We have the development of the guilds, we have the development of communes. That could help all the way around, and we can also then self-govern ourselves. This became an issue of incorporation, what we today call incorporation. We have incorporated cities and unincorporated cities. As I said before, a corporation, the basic definition, is a legal person, has the right to sue or be sued. Now, that is in some ways what was developing with the emergence of the communes. One of the suggested readings, or these suggested readings for this week, is Guibert Nogent, The Revolt of Loon. And if you do read that, or look at that, you'll see that it can be forced because the citizens at Loon violently forced their bishop to acknowledge them as a commune. Ended up killing their archbishop or their bishop, which was not a frequent event, but certainly was not unheard of. And I've written on another case in Magdeburg in the 14th century where the citizens rose up and killed their archbishop of Magdeburg. But if you do look at that document, Guibert of Nogent wrote alone, you'll see that the citizens are taking matters into their own hands and they are proclaiming themselves as a commune with rights and privileges. And they're forcing it by violence. That's what the revolt was about, in essence. So this also shows that the medieval world was not simply obedience and following what you were told, not thinking for yourselves. These are people who are saying we need to govern ourselves, and we're being basically screwed over by our overlord, the bishop, and we're going to force this issue. Yes, he's part of the clergy, so what? We're still going to kill the bastard because he's such an asshole to us. Basically, I'm not supposed to be using bad language, I'm sorry. But the point being is that's what they're thinking and feeling. Now, there are also establishments of communes not based on citizens' revolts, but based on citizens petitioning a higher overlord, even the king or the emperor. And within the empire, which is a term I hope you know what that refers to now, under the emperor, they were called imperial free cities. Cities who were directly under the emperor. And in France, it's directly under the king or the local. So there's different types of communes. And why would the king grant a charter, a legal document, granting a city its independence, let's say? Because what it does, it removes the city from this feudal hierarchy. Because all of a sudden, the city as one thing is no longer each individual within the city, underneath their immediate overlord. So let's say the citizens of Loon, and this is imaginary because this did not happen, because they did force the issue and were received the designation of a commune from their bishop, their immediate feudal overlord, which also shows that bishops too were feudal lords. What if, let's say, instead of doing that, this violent revolt, they had petitioned the King of France? Said, okay, Louis, must have been one of the Louis. Anyway, we would like to be a commune. We would like to be your city. We'll be directly under your authority. Why would that be a good thing? Well, for us, all of a sudden we are outside the feudal structure, the feudal hierarchy. Because if our now bishop or prince, duke or whatever tries to give us a problem, we say, we have the king behind us because we're the king's city. So all of a sudden that hierarchy that I put on the slide before the midterm, it's a structure then that we're outside of that. We're taken out of that as a commune. And the king says, great. Because I'll tell you what, I will do that if you also make sure that I can come through your city and you will host me whenever it's needed. He said, of course, we'll do that for you, king. Of course. So all of a sudden, a city is placed as an entity, as a corporate entity, directly under the king, just as the high nobility. it's not so much a fief, a granting of land, but it is somewhat like that because the king then would say, okay, this city is directly under me, outside of the feudal hierarchy. Could cause tensions. Now, that was a good deal for the king because the king was also like, then if I don't have to deal with my vassals, because they can be a real pain too sometimes, I have support. I have direct support. They pay their dues. They provide me with so many knights from the city itself. So it's a symbiotic relationship. You can govern yourselves as long as you fulfill your feudal dues directly to the king rather than to your immediate overlord. And you are no longer under the authority of your immediate overlord. You're directly under the authority of the king. You're a free city. And even though the term free imperial free cities refers to the empire, the French communes too, communes in England didn't develop nearly as much as in France and in the empire. Why? I don't know. English are, they're English. Anyway, point being, they too were free royal cities under the king, or also then under the prince instead of the local feudal overlord. Like with Loan, they were not directly under the king; they were directly, responsible to their overlord, the bishop, and they still had to fulfill their vows. They just did it as a commune, as a whole. So these are some of the tensions involved, and some of the developments that are going on. So all of a sudden, you have institutions, towns, guilds as corporate structures that are independent of the legal feudal system as it was being devised also at this time. Things were changing, all based on the increase of wealth, the economic takeoff. All of a sudden, you have self governance, and the feudal system, so to speak, is being challenged, even if it was not necessarily seen as a challenge at the time. Implicitly, the structures are beginning to crack. And with that, then too, the whole issue of the rise in the economic takeoff and the increase of trade, we have the Renaissance of commerce. Up here, I have the sign, the Renaissance slide, the Renaissance of commerce. The commercial revolution, banking, finance, and the problem of usury trade. Christendom looks outward. A renaissance of commerce, a rebirth of commerce, and also the term, the commercial revolution, has been used by an historian, medievalist, to refer to this period as the commercial revolution, a real revolution, if you think about it. Because once you have your economic base being the city, and you have guilds, of traders or merchants that can function as a whole for the city. And trade really develops. Trade takes off at this time. And if we look further at this slide, we find that we have, the development of different types of trade. Now, I know this is going to the third point, and I haven't talked about the banking and the finance issue. But let me do the trade first. I'll come back to the banking and finance. I have maps, and don't ask me why, but I could not copy this slide. I would like to have copied this slide and also then put it after the maps, but for some reason that didn't work with the PowerPoint, so my apologies. So I'm going to go through the different maps and then come back to this slide, which is the last slide of the presentation besides the maps, if that makes sense to people. Now we have the medieval Hansa, as I mentioned. If you go to that first map, this is the Hanseatic. It's called the Hanseatic trade. The Hansa was a group, a guild of North German traders. And if you look at the map, you can see where they had their outposts. And the Hansa was a Hanseatic league. They were leagued together. And they traded throughout the North Sea and then into the Baltic, and then extended down. So there is somewhat still local but they had this trade network that was established. But this is not the only trade network. The Levant trade was there, which is then getting into the area in this next slide, which includes in Venice and Genoa. Because Venice and Genoa, so you can see all of a sudden this next map here has not only the Hansa commercial routes, but also Venice and Genoa. And why Venice and Genoa? If you look on the map, they are right there in the Mediterranean. If you look at Italy, if you don't know where Venice and Genoa are, look to Italy. I hope you can recognize Italy. And if you go up, and I'm looking at the slide right now, so I'm not looking at all of you. I'm pointing to it. If you look at the boot of Italy, at the very bottom, we keep going up to the north, right where it kind of joins with the rest of the landmass. On Genoa, you see on the left, and Venice, you see on your right. Those are port cities which have direct access to all of the Mediterranean. Trade is blossoming, and trade means fairs. We have there's cities with of commercial fairs and cities. So this whole economic development of trade and fairs and exchange of new goods and new products is amazing. And then in the 13th century, we have then long distance trade with the Far East. Marco Polo, we all hear about the overland route to the Far East, where there are spices, where there are silks, luxury goods that Europeans really liked. And it's not just Marco Polo, but he's the most well-known one. And you can see there his routes overland. Now, the problem there was it was expensive and risky. Both the trade of the Middle Hansa, the trade of the Levant, the trade of the Far East was all risky. You could make a lot of money. You could also go broke. So the problem of financing this, and have it there, the problem of usury. Because usury was a sin. Usury was actually charging of interest. It had been thought of, if you're a Christian, you could not loan money to someone and charge interest. You could, based on your goodwill, loan them money for their own use, and then they pay you back when they can, but not with interest. Now some of you say, well, wait a minute. What about the parable of the landowner and the talents, who certainly did advocate for investment to his workers, servants, and chastised the third one who didn't do anything and just stuck the money under his bed? Then he comes back and he says, here's your money. He says, you could have at least loaned it out at interest, so I could have made more money. That, yes, is a scriptural story. But for the earlier period up through this time, there's still this sense of usury, is the idea that you should be paid for your labor. So if I give you money and I expect you to pay me back more, I'm making money when I've done nothing. The usury laws were in place. So the problem was, how can we support investment for the risk taking to finance the trade and get around the usury laws? There began to be ways to do that. The same thing with banking. Banking, you could not charge, interest for banking. And what do banks do? They loan out money. That's why, too, here, and we'll see, beginning in the 12th century, but all the way up into the 16th century, with a couple of exceptions, the primary bankers of Europe were Jewish, because the Jews didn't have any problem with usury. And the Christians didn't have any problems with the Jews sinning even more by engaging in usury, and they needed the financing. The Fuggers became a major banking house. And then in Italy in the 14th century, when we get there, we'll see that the Bardi Bank and then the Medici Bank, of course, is the most famous, were Christians, but still had to find out ways to get around the usury laws. And that begins here already in the 11th and 12th centuries with the trade that's going on. Now, if you lose it all, that's a problem. But if you can take a risk and profit from it, that's okay. And that was kind of the way that they got around it. So if you're taking a risk, so you are taking a risk with your money, and so therefore you should be compensated for that risk, which is not the same as profiting from your goodwill. Usury is profiting from your goodwill. So thinking of a loan shark. A loan shark is profiting based on someone's need. That is usury. Whereas if you invest in a company in stock market, you're taking a risk. So you should be able to be compensated for your risk that you're taking because you could lose all your money. Anyway, that's the whole. There's not the same because there's no stock yet. There's no joint stock company that doesn't develop until the 17th century. But the whole point here is that financing is developing. Instruments of finance are developing. Ways around the usury laws are being found. Banking, both Jewish bankers and then some Christian bankers too, but more primarily Jewish bankers, are enabling investment. And Jewish bankers became increasingly wealthy, and that's going to be an increasing problem, as did Jewish merchants, in terms of anti-Judaism. Later on, when things start going wrong, whom do we blame? But we'll get there when we get there with that. Because at first, it's like, okay. It's interesting to note, too, that the papacy and the kings and monarchs always supported the Jews. They always defended the Jews. Why? Because they needed their financing. The anti-Jewish or anti-Semitic outbreaks that we find were not sanctioned by the powers that be, so to speak. But that gets into more issues. We'll see some of that next week's lectures with the Crusades, too. But anyway, the whole point of all of this is that Christendom is developing. All of these developments beginning around the year 1000, and with trade, long distance trade, I have it there. Europe looks outward. Christendom looks outward. Christendom looks outward. I think I said before, the midterm of this first part is very insular. They were aware of things out there, but still they were looking at kind of more inwardly. How do we, get our own house in order? How can we convert these Germanic pagans? How can we expand Christendom and rule ourselves? Yes, the threat of Islam was an issue, but, we got to get our own house in order. And now, around the year 1000, we start looking at all kinds of things. Trade, bringing in foreign products and everything else, wealth increasing. And Christendom as a whole begins to be aware of itself within the larger world context. And this doesn't mean everybody was that way. People working on the manors probably didn't really think much about, the Spice Islands or Chinese silk or whatever. Pepper. But people who wanted to make money certainly did. How do we go about doing this? And for example, we will never understand Columbus when we get there if we don't understand this foundation of medieval trade emerging in the course of the 10th, 11th, 12th, 13th centuries, part of this medieval renaissance, a renaissance of economic development, a renaissance of trade, a renaissance of commerce. We have the guilds, we have the universitas of the guilds, we have the communes, a new structure of corporate law, and Christendom is being challenged on all fronts in terms of what had supposedly traditionally been the case. Now, traditionally, it doesn't mean all that long because, again, I said what they're doing in the 12th century is codifying the way things had been, almost in a sense of we're worried about these developments. How do we put them together? If we're talking about the feudal system legally, that's codified in the 12th century based on kind of looking back and idealizing what had happened. Whereas, as I think I tried to explain before the midterm in the lecture on feudalism, manorialism, it was really a ground up development. Now, that's the situation we're looking at as we move into the high Middle Ages from the early Middle Ages. That's why, too, your assigned readings for this week begin with the textbook William Jordan's Europe in the High Middle Ages. And the suggested readings I already said for this week is Guibert of Nogent, The Revolt at Lomme, which gets into some of these issues and gives a great example of them, and I think also demonstrates very well that members of Christendom, people within Europe at this time, were not simply passive, non-thinking individuals. They were looking for how to make their lives better, and at times would do so violently. It doesn't matter if you're a bishop. It doesn't matter if you're a member of the clergy. We're going to, go after you if you are screwing us over, so to speak. Things are changing within Christendom. Also, religiously, things are changing. And we'll look at some of those changes, which then parallel some of these developments I've talked about today in the next lecture in terms of the new monasticism. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.